Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about a couple of things. So we're going to have a look over a couple of concepts in React, which we didn't get to last time, as well as look over React Router in a simple fashion. But the main thing we're going to talk about is state, right? So it's application state, and we have some state mechanisms in React itself, but those generally aren't sufficient. We're going to talk about why they're not sufficient. And additionally, we're going to write something with Redux, right, which is the typical state mechanism used in most of these components-based frameworks. Um, Now, in our application with Redux, we're also going to go on a tangent and use external components, so components written by somebody else, which are a way of better scaling our effort, right? It's we're not going to constantly reinvent the wheel. So first things first, I've created a let me just share my screen, my window, right? So share. I've created a couple of basic React apps here, so we don't have to wait for them to be created. So the first thing we're going to look at is going to be the simple routing app. Now, when talking about routing, what we're talking about actually is being able to refer a particular state of our application externally. Right, so I want to, for example, send an email with a code, or if I have a cat app, I want to go to a particular cat. How am I going to give somebody a link to that particular cat? Now, this problem typically is trivial because in general on the web I have resources and addresses to those resources. However, in our case, the complication comes from the fact that we have a single page app, so it's a single resource. So how do we refer things inside our app? Now this is actually not all that mysterious because when we've built our basic SPA with handlebars, we actually implemented something router-like. So the way we're going to refer to states of our application is going to be through fragments. The same thing is going to happen here. We're going to do it with a library called React Router. As per usual, we could implement this. However, it's basically not worth it. Because we can use something maintained by the people who created React Router. So I'm going to go to simple routing and I'm going to install React Router DOM. Um, Unfortunately, this has actually had a major version change recently, so we're going to use a particular version. Let me just open this whole folder. Which is going to be the previous version. And I'll come back with an example later on in this course. I'll come back with an example for the current version. Uh, the documentation for now refers to version 5. So we could just add the dependency here. Let me just see what the version is supposed to be. Because if we don't specify the version, we're going to get version 6. And we're going to use this one. This is just the previous version. So I'm going to run npm install, and this is going to install my router. And while this happens, we could go to the source. One sec. So we could go to the source and think about what we'd like to have. So we'd like to have a main component which is going to be where we land when we go to the root of our application, and we're also going to want to have an item component which is going to have a parameter, right? So in keeping with the cat example, so if I want to go to a specific cat, I should be able to mention which cat it is. So I'm going to create a couple of files. So I'm going to have a main.js, and I'm going to have an item.js. And these are going to basically be, let me just delete a bunch of pre-generated things here. We don't care about much of this. So we're going to want to we're going to want to have some basic components. One of them is main. Just call it main, and it just says I am the main component. And one of them is item. And this one says I am the item component for now. So we want to be able to navigate to each of these components. So if we go to app, what we're first going to want to do is import a couple of things. So we're going to need a router, something to handle the routing part. And we're going to use a router based on the fragment, so hash router as router. We're also going to need to define routes, and the principle of this is very much like the one we've seen in Express. And we're also going to need an additional component called switch, and I'm going to explain why we need this shortly. So from React router DOM. Now, up until this point, what we had is our application containing a tree of components which couldn't be referred through an address, right, in our previous examples. Now this time, we're going to be able to refer to them, but our application is going to sort of still look like a tree of components. That's because we have something which is called declarative routing, which means that the routing bit is going to be just React components. So our application is going to return a router, and the router is going to contain a bunch of routes. Now these are selected via route matching, so I can say something like route path is slash. So if I go to the root, something is rendered. So let's say main is rendered, which we're going to get from main.js. And if I go to this with a parameter, now how would we send the parameter? Well, it's going to be just the same as Express. So this is going to mean that I'm going to have some sort of matching object, which is going to have a key, and the key is going to be item, and the value is going to be whatever matched. And this is going to take me to item. Now I have a couple of problems here. The first problem is the fact that if a route is matched based on this path, the routing doesn't stop, right? So that means that if I have something which under some circumstances matches both this one and this one, they're both going to be included. So in order to avoid this, I can use a switch. And this just says if something is matched, the routing stops. Now I can also have catch-all routes, so that is routes which have a star here, so they have a they can match anything. And this would be what I would use, for example, for the situation where somebody comes with a route which I cannot match generally. So it's a 404 error. Now I have another problem which is not necessarily transparent, which is that by default in React Router, routes are not matched by equality, which means it's actually a starts with, not an equals, which means both of these are still going to match, right? So if I go to slash item, unfortunately this is going to match first, so I'm always going to get main. So the answer for this is to use exact, which is a Boolean property, and this time this is only going to match with equality, so only slash and this only slash something. So let's see it until this point. There's a bunch more stuff which we're not going to see now, such as the fact that routers can be used inside routers, such as the fact that I can have optional parameters and so forth. But if need be, we'll get back to this. So for the basic functionality, let's just see what's going to happen here. Hopefully. Why is it not starting? Maybe it just takes a while. Yeah. Right, so item is not defined. We forgot to import item. Right, so I am the main component, and if I go to something, I am the item component. But the item component, as of yet, is not really all that useful because it can only function if it understands what it was sent. Right, so if it can get the parameter. Think about it like this: it may need to do something from the server, or it may need to do something with the item. So the way to do this is to use a hook. Now this hook is not included in React itself. It's from React Router DOM. It's not the only hook. I have also hooks to give me the whole path and so forth, but in this case, we only care about params. So we can now say params as use params. I am the item component for params.item. Right, so it says I am the item component for something. Now let's dwell a bit on this for a bit. Now, how did the parameters get here? We're going to see a custom hook a bit later, but the idea is this item component was actually item of props, and because this routing logic was used, there was this property called match, and match had match.params. Now, if we had written our components as class-based components, we would have had to deal with this explicitly. But because we have hooks, most of the stuff is done for us. So we can access the item here, which is going to mean we can actually react to the value of the item. One sec. Right, so this is the basics of routing, and this is going to allow me to get to a particular part of my application. Now, let's get back to our concepts, and we're going to want to look over a couple of things. So, like I said, we also want to write a custom hook, but mostly we want to discuss about the idea of state. Now, if I have a somewhat more complex application, I'm probably going to want to pass state or to have state accessible in various components. Now, the typical way of doing this, and we've seen this last time, is to pass state through props or to pass functions which modify state through props, what is called lefting. And I can do this for a simple application. However, as the application becomes more complex, this becomes more and more tedious. Because if I think about my application as a tree of components, if I need something in a leaf of this tree, which comes from another leaf of this tree, it's going to have to be passed upwards until the first common ancestor, and then passed downwards until the receiving leaf. So how would I avoid this? How would I avoid passing states through properties, through all the intervening properties? Now there's two ways to do this, which exist in React. One of them is a bit too cumbersome, which is called concepts, and one of them is incompletely implemented, which is called reducers. Now, reducers are a concept which comes from Redux, and we're going to see it in Redux in its, say, full form. But in React, let's just see it in React. We're going to take a couple. We're going to go back to our concepts app, and we're going to take a couple of examples and explain them. Okay. So first off, let's talk about contexts. Okay. Now, contexts function like this. There is a special object which has been created with React, which is called the context. Now, this object has state variants, right? So I can select between various, let's say, state bundles. Contexts are not designed to keep global state in the sense of the regular functioning of the application, but rather to keep, let's say, configuration state. So a good candidate for this is holding the, if I have a dark mode in my application, holding the color theme. And we're going to see exactly this kind of example. Let's have a file here called context parent. We're also going to have a file which is going to hold the context itself. Then we're going to have a container, and then we're going to have a component. And the logic here is going to be that the context parent is going to have access to the context, and it is the only one who's going to have access to changing the context. And then in its subtree, wherever I am, I'm going to be able to access that context. That makes the context parent a context provider, and whoever needs the context, a context consumer. Now let's look at the context itself. I'm just going to copy paste this stuff, and we're going to talk about it as needed. One sec. Right, so the context itself, like I said, is a special object in the sense that it's created with react.createContext. And I can see that what I'm doing is selecting between, let's call them some state bundles. Right, it's either the dark theme or the light theme or the dark theme. Now the context parent is going to be what is called a context provider. Right, so it's going to look like this. And I notice a couple of things. It is the only one who can change the context. Right, so it can do this set theme business. Then it uses a context.provider with a particular context value, which is the theme, to send to its descendants. Now, if I was in the situation where I would just pass stuff through the props, theme container would have to get the prop, would have to get the theme from its parent and pass it downwards until it, until the end of its children subtree. But in our case, because we're using context, we can ignore this, and theme component is going to be something which is not aware of the context. Right? So the container just contains a component. So we've managed to not pass the prop downwards. Now the question becomes, how will I access the prop within theme component which does need it? Well, theme component has to have access to the context and use a context.consumer. And notice that this is a function dependent on the context. Right, so this is what's going to happen here. Let's just test it out. So in app, I'm going to have a context, and we can look at it. Theme container. Oh, I forgot to save this. Right, and I can see that if I click this button, I can actually switch the theme. But like I said, this is a mechanism which was created to do this kind of work, which is I have a global configuration of an application and I switch between two possible configurations. This is useful for stuff like internationalization, so changing all the assets in the application or theming or stuff like that. This is not going to, it's going to be hard to force this to help us with managing the state relating to the functionality of our application. Now let's see the second thing which we might use, which is called the reducer. Now this is going to be a simple example, but which is going to allow us to understand the general principles of reducers, and this is going to help us with understanding Redux. Now what's happening in React is that basically you have the reducer example. So one sec. you have the reducers from Redux, but in a partially implemented form. You can use them, but you're going to run into some complications. So I have this hook, which is called useReducer. And the first question is, what is a reducer? Now, a reducer is an element of state, only it's represented in a fashion which maybe you've not run into before, which is it's an element of state, which is a function. It's a function which, given a particular state, starting from an initial state, and an action, based on that action, returns a new version of the state. Right? So it doesn't modify the state, but rather it returns a new version of it. So I can see how a reducer looks like, right? So it's a function of state and action. Now the way to use the reducer is to use this function in the initial state, because it does need a state to start from, and it's going to return something to access the state and something called the dispatch. Now dispatch is going to handle dispatching actions. This means that this is related to the fact that the only way to change a reducer's content, right? The only way to change whatever a reducer gives me is through an action, right? I have to trigger an action to dispatch an action, and based on that action, the reducer is going to return a new state. Right, now let's see this working. One sec, let me just duplicate this here. So we're gonna say reducers or reducer. And we can see it working, right? It's going to modify this. Now, a couple of problems here, which are not visible necessarily in this example. What we might want, so if I use a reducer like I did here in one component, it's not really all that useful. That's not what reducers are for. That's not what they do. Because if I have some state which is related, which can relate to only one component, I don't need reducers. I have viewState, right? So typically, if I have state which is internal to a component, I'm going to use viewState. Now, where reducers come in is when I have state which must be used or can be modified and used by multiple components, and I want all of them to have access to the same state. Well, that's fine. However, in this React variant, I'm going to have to handle each reducer and each dispatcher separately. So if I have an action which applies to multiple reducers, such as we're going to see actions like this in the next example. If I have an action which can apply to multiple reducers, I'm going to have to go reducer by reducer and dispatch the action. Now, the question which comes up here is, now if I don't want to do that, and what I actually want to do is use a single dispatcher for some sort of structure of reducers, right? A tree of reducers, for example. How would I combine the reducers? And what's interesting here is we can combine the reducers, of course, but what we'll end up doing is re-implementing what Redux already does. So if at some point we have all these pieces, we're not going to need Redux. But for now, we just have to rebuild Redux ourselves, which means that this particular functionality is not as useful as it seems. Now, something else Redux is going to do for us is, let's say we want to have some sort of logging, which is going to tell us whenever a reducer modifies its state, any reducer. How would we go about that? Now, this is actually something which is very similar to Express middleware, right? So for Express middleware, what I had is some code which was run whenever a request was made, for example. Um, in this case, I want to have some code which is run whenever the state is changed. Now, I have no mechanism for this, but in Redux, I do have something for this, and it's going to prove extremely useful. So there are some limitations to React reducers. You can try to use them. However, it's going to be a bit more complicated. There's a Stack Overflow question for this, for combining reducers, and the answer is basically the implementation from React Redux with a link to the implementation from React Redux. Right? So it's a bit pointless to do this. Now, the last thing we want to see, this isn't necessarily connected to state, is how these hooks actually can be defined. Can we define our hooks? And the answer is yes. We're going to get back to state shortly because we'll get back to a Redux application shortly. But for now, let's look at an additional example here. So we're going to call it custom, and we're going to say it's custom hook example, and we're going to start from our state example. So we have something with a counter. Anyway, let's say instead of and let's say we modify it for a bit. We're going to say it handle increase, and we're also going to have a handle decrease. And this is still going to be handle increase, and we're also going to have a button for handle decrease. Right, so let's also include it so we can test it out. Right, so oh, let's modify it a bit because it's handle it's this is should be minus, and this should actually do minus. So we can see it here. What if we'd like to have this be guarded? So it's supposed to happen, but only in a particular interval, right? So it's we can increase and decrease, but only between 0 and 10. How do we go about that? Well, let's assume we can make our own hook, and we say use guarded state. And because it's in between 0 and 10, probably we're going to have to pass this somehow. So the idea is, what is a hook? Well, the answer is the hook is actually a plain function. So use guarded state of initial min max. And let's say we keep the state with a use state, so inside of it, so we have a value set value is use state of initial. So instead of doing set value whenever, we're gonna say if right, we're gonna say const set guarded of next value, and we're gonna say only if next value is larger or equal greater than or equal than min, and less or equal max, then set value of next value. And so we're wrapping the use state in something we've created. So we're now going to return value and set guarded. Right, so we've created our own custom hook. Let's see if it works. Right, so it no longer goes below 0, and it no longer goes above 10. So we could extract this in a different module and use it in various components. So this would be the hook logic and the context, concepts part for React. If we need anything else, we'll come back to this. Right. So before getting back to state and seeing how an app using Redux is going to be organized, I'm going to pause for a bit and take questions. Right. So now let's get back to our discussion about state. Now, something to note is that for your projects or your exams, you're not going to need Redux, right? So Redux is there for the situation where you have an application which is complex enough that you can no longer easily track state updates, right? So if you have three components, you're not going to need Redux. However, for any application of sufficient size, you're easily going to run into a bunch of problems, which is whenever you're going to need some sort of global state, right? And if you do, you're going to, whenever you need global state, what can happen is the state is updated, but not everybody knows about it. Or the state is updated by two components at the same time. Only since you don't have any atomicity ensured, right? So you don't necessarily know that one update finishes and then the other one starts. What might happen is that different operations of the update process from the two updates are going to be interspersed, and this is going to might lead you to an invalid state. Now, this kind of error is to be especially is it's this is to be avoided because this kind of error is not even going to be 100% replicable, right? Somebody's going to tell you you have a bug, and you're going to check, and you're not going to have a bug, and it's going to happen in a percentage of the cases. So this is exactly the kind of thing which you might want to avoid. Now, like I said, you can actually use the reducers from React. So the reducers from React have potential, but they're missing a couple of things, right? So you're basically going to replace Redux with a somewhat more poorly implemented own version of Redux. So let's see what the structure of when we're going to structure our application, what the structure of our application is going to be, and how Redux ties into everything. So we have this Redux app, and we have a couple of things here. So we have a create React app application with nothing more, and we have the server from last time, right? So it's the book server, and we actually need some sort of network communication to showcase how we can solve this sort of interaction, which involves promises. So we're going to start our server and ignore it. We're not going to change anything for it. Hopefully it has some data because initially we're not going to be able to add data in our initial pass, so to speak. And now let's go back to this app. Let's strip everything we don't need. So what we're not going to need is this, all CSS. We're just going to keep app and index.js. Okay, now we're going to want our components to be grouped, so let's have a folder called components, just so we can better look at them. We're going to move app here. This means this is not going to work out. Let's also delete all the stuff we've just stripped out. Right. Right, so like I said, the state is going to be kept in some reducers. We're going to keep them in a folder called reducers. Now, the only changes in the state are going to be triggered based on some actions. Now, we said that one of the problems we had with React reducers is that they couldn't be grouped together. So we're going to group them together in something which is called a store. And the last thing, this is optional, but we want to have any configuration that we might have, we're going to put in a config file. It's going to be our hard-coded server, but this is at least going to allow us to know what we've hard-coded, so we can then modify it to be dynamic if need be. So let's start with this config bit, right? So this is just going to have a global JS, and here let me just copy paste it. It's just our server, right? So it's just going to be our hard-coded server. Okay, we're no longer going to need this. Now let's see the rest of these. So we're going to, in our components, we're going to have a book editor. For now, it's not going to be much. Let's just, oh, let's just strip out everything we don't need. Right, so book editor, which we're going to take from the current folder. And book editor for now is just going to be a somewhat plain component. Right. Now we need at least an action, at least a reducer, and the store. Now at least an action. Now something to take into account is if we look at our previous example. Let's just open it for a bit longer. What happened is the reducer only changed whenever I dispatched an action, and the action was something which had a type, but also it might have a value, right? It might have a payload, something it encapsulates. This is going to be the regular case. We're generally not going to care about just the type of the action, but also about the payload. Now let's think about how this would function if we'd make a request to the server. What are my states to which I have to write? What are the states of my action? Now my action is going to be something asynchronous, which is going to be wrapped in a promise. Right? It's going to be a promise. Now promise itself has three possible states. Right? So it has pending, fulfilled, and rejected. This means I probably have to handle all of these states. Right? So I'm going to have three actions distinctly, and the reducer is going to have to react to these three actions, right? So my reducers are going to have to react to these three actions. So the request is pending, and maybe I want to have a state element which is going to show something loading. The request is fulfilled, and then I'm going to show the data. Or the request is rejected, and maybe I want to have some sort of visual element displaying an error. Either way, I have to react to these three possibilities, these three states I might be in. The problem is I'm going to keep rewriting the same code over and over, right? Now I have a solution for Redux because Redux supports middleware, and I can use a middleware which is going to handle this for me. This means that whenever I have something asynchronous, I'm just going to talk about the action itself. In this case, it's going to be get books. And the middleware is going to transform this action into three distinct actions because promises always work the same way, right? So this is possible. So if I talk about get books, the reducer is actually going to have the chance to react to a get books fulfilled, a get books pending, a get books fulfilled, and a get books rejected. Now that being said, let's go to our actions, and we're going to have a book actions.js. Uh, just for convenience's sake, we might want to bundle all of these so we can treat them as one thing, and we're going to have an index.js. Now, what do I mean here? Well, if I import a folder instead of a file, what I'm importing is an index.js file in that folder. So first, let's look at book actions and write a simple action, uh, considering the fact that somebody else is going to handle the asynchronous part. So first off, we need our server, right, from config/global. Second off, and this is just somewhat good practice, as we're going to explicitly write the possible action types, and we could move this in a different file and just have a file where we can see all the actions that might be dispatched. For now, we're just going to leave them here. So we have a get books. All right, so it's export const get books. Now it's time for our action. Now our action is just going to be a function. It has no parameters because it's a get all, and it has to return something which is action like, right? It's this is what the reducer is going to have the chance to handle. So this is going to have a type, and it's going to have a payload. Right, so this function is actually going to return my action, which has a type and a payload. And the payload, in our case, we said it's going to involve communicating with the server, etc. Is going to be asynchronous. And here we're going to do something relatively basic. We're going to say response. We're not going to wonder about errors too much. So we're going to say await fetch server slash box. So data is await response.json. And after all is said and done, return data. Okay, so that's my action. We're going to go back, can come back to this later and write the rest of the actions. Now, who's going to react to this? Like I said, we're going to have a mechanism which, instead of just having the type getBooks, is going to transform this into 3 different action types depending on the payload, the corresponding payload depending on the promised states. So let's go to reducers and make a reducer which is going to react to this. Again, we're going to have a book reducer, and an index.js to just give us the reducers in one thing. Now the reducer has to have an initial state. Now this particular reducer represents a book list, but we're going to group a couple of things with it. So it's going to be a book list, and in the initial state, it's going to be an empty list, right? An empty array. Now what else might I have here? Well, I might have an error. Now initially there's no error. What else would I care about? Well, it's a fetching. This means that the promise is pending, and this is false. And another one which is fetched. This is relevant if I want to have a caching mechanism, right? Because what might happen is, even though I've not been able to get the data now, I might have a previous version, right, which is fetched. I fetched it at least once. Now, as for how the reducer looks, it's going to look just like it did in React. So it's a function reducer of a state, which is, if it's not mentioned, it's the initial state, and an action. And for this, we have to somehow react to the action type and return a new state. So I'm going to have a switch of action type, and I'm going to have a bunch of cases and a default. For default, I'm just going to return state. Now, like I said, I don't actually have one action, but 3. We're going to see how we get this shortly. But I'm going to have a get books pending, a get books fulfilled, and a get books rejected. And for each of these, I'm going to want to return a state. So, like I said, I'm not modifying the state, I'm returning a new one. So I'm returning an object. I'm not going to, not all of the new state is going to be different from the old state. So what I'm doing is I'm destructuring state here. So this is just a copy of the state. And let's see what's going to happen if this is pending. Well, I have no error. Fetching is true, and fetched is false because it didn't happen yet. Now, like I said, if you want a caching mechanism, this is going to be a bit different, but for our case, this is sufficient. What about fulfilled? Well, I can start from this. I know if it's fulfilled, I know that the action payload is going to contain a book list. It's no longer fetching, and it's been fetched. What about rejected? Well, I know the action payload is going to contain an error. It's no longer fetching, and it's not fetched. So that's my reducer, at least in this state. Now, there's something else to do. For actions, we did this bit in index. What? No, I wrote it in the wrong file, so this is the actions. Well, nope. This is in book actions. So both for actions and for reducers, we're going to want to combine everything for the index. Now for actions, this is going to be a bit simpler. We're just going to import everything and expose it as one model. So import star as book actions from book actions. And we're going to say export book actions. For reducers, well, this is going to be a bit more complicated. If we do this, it's not going to work. We need something which is going to handle the fact that to handle this the fact that the reducers have to be able to react to the same actions, and this is going to be done through something which is called combined reducers, which you're going to get from Redux. Now we're going to get all of our reducers. In this case, we're going to say book from book reducer, and what we're going to export is going to be combined reducers of all the reducers. Now, maybe we should actually install the stuff we need. So we're going to need Redux. Now, Redux isn't React specific, so it has a React Redux package. And I said that Redux can have middleware. And we're going to need two of them. So it's going to be Redux Logger, which is a logging middleware. It's something that writes to the console state updates. And we said that we're going to use a middleware to handle the asynchronous part. It's going to be called Redux Promise Middleware. Let's just install this. Now, what else is missing? Well, apart from the logic we're going to have in the book editor, which we don't care about for now, in order to have Redux working, we're going to have need to have a store. Now, this store, let's just try to sort of build it. The store is going to be import create store from Redux. So this is going to create a store based on some aggregate reducers. So we can do something like this. So we're going to get reducer from reducers. So we can now do store is create store of reducer. This should be enough, and export default store. However, we need a couple more things because we said we want to use that those middleware. So apply middleware. We're then going to import them. And then we can do const middleware is apply middleware of a list of middleware. So logger and promise. And this is going to allow us to create the store based on the reducers, the aggregated reducers, and the aggregated middleware. One more thing before we can use Redux, which is we should go to index and we're going to import a couple of things. So first of all, we're going to need our store. Second of all, we're going to have something which is called a provider from Redux. And the whole app is going to be in this provider component. Now this doesn't make sense. The provider has to have a store. And this is right now we can actually access any part of our store from anywhere in our application. So let's try to do this. So let's go to book editor and turn this into and try to access something from the store / dispatch an action. So first things first, we're going to need our action. Second, we need to have a mechanism to get the state in such a fashion that whenever the state changes, we know about it, right? So we're going to need something from Redux. So we're going to need use selector. We're also going to need to dispatch the action. So use dispatch. And also, when we get part of the state, we're interested in getting that part only if it's changed. So how do we check that it's changed? Well, I can notice that, so I need some sort of state comparison thing. And I'm going to use something which is called shallow equal. Now, why does this work if it's shallow? Well, because the state is actually replaced, right? We saw that we're not modifying anything. We're actually replacing it. If you look at our reducer, what we're doing is we're returning a new object. So shallow equal is going to work just fine. Now, the state may be a lot, right? That I might have a lot of state. I'm not interested if something in the state changed. I'm interested if something, if a particular part of the state has changed. So I'm going to use a function called the selector. I'm going to say book list selector. And this is just going to allow me to get part of the state. So we're going to say with state.book.book_list. Now, does this make sense? Let's see. Well, if we look at the store, right, the store is the state. It has a component called book, which in turn contains book list. So that's what I'm getting. Right, so I have this book list selector. It doesn't give me any state. That's because I have to say const book list is use selector of my selector, and what kind of equality am I enforcing? So shallow equal. This is a lot more efficient. So if it works, I should use this. Now, what else? Well, the book list, right now, there's nothing to change the book list, which means uh, I'm always going to have an empty array. So let's fill that array. So what we want to do is, whenever this component is first loaded, we'd like to make a request to the server. And to do this, we'd like to dispatch an action. So we need some way to dispatch an action. So we're going to say const dispatch is use dispatch. Right, so now we have a way to dispatch an action. What's left is to have an effect, right? We need an effect which is going to run only once. So we're going to say use effect, which we're going to get from React, of some function and some dependencies. Now my dependency is actually going to be dispatch, but dispatch isn't going to change. Um, we're gonna say dispatch of book actions dot get books. Right, so this is going to dispatch the action, which is going to make the request, which, if everything goes according to plan, is going to change the book list, which is going to trigger this component being redrawn. For now, we don't actually draw anything, so let's draw something. We're going to delete this soonish because we want something a bit better. But even in this form, we can say booklist.map. We're going to say with element, we're going to draw a little div for each of the books. And like I said, I hope we have something in this particular database. So key is going to be e.id, and we're going to say e.title has e.content. Right, so this should work, assuming we've not forgotten anything. So let's run this. Don't care about this, don't care about this. Right, we forgot something. So let's go here. Okay, I think it's from React Redux. Yes. Right, and we can see our book. Also, if we look in the console, we can see what happened to our action, right? So we have the first state, then we get the get books pending, basically. Then we get the get books fulfilled. And this one has a payload, which means that the next state is going to contain my book list, which fortunately contains a book, so we don't have to add something with Postman or anything like that. So that's the general form of a Redux application. Now we could continue with this, or we could use some custom components, and we're going to use some custom components just so we have something which is let's say easier to look at. And the custom components we're going to use are something which is called Prime React. Right, so these obviously have a little guide on how to set them up, and they take out a lot of effort we might have to do. So let's look at what we're going to use now. It's a data table, and I can look at the basic data table. I can select hook source here and look at it, and I can going to see that the data table is going to be something which has an array as a value and contains a bunch of columns, each of the columns representing a field in one element of the array. But before we continue, I'm going to pause and take any questions you might have. Radio. So we need this prime React business. Now, if we're not going to read the documentation live, but you can see the installation guide here. To give you the cliff notes of the installation, there's a bunch of dependencies, right? Not only these, if I look further down, I'm going to see that my dependencies are these: React transition group, prime icons, and we're also going to have a couple more. So we're going to say npmi prime React, which is the components, prime icons, which is a bunch of SVG icons, prime flex, which is a Twitter bootstrap like set of CSS files, and React transition group, which is an animation library that this particular library uses. Now I'm going to notice something else, which is while it gets installed, which is I have to include some CSS files because this is themable, right? So I can select a theme here, right? And it's going to change how it looks. And we can use any of these themes. Let me just see what happened to the installation. That's perfect. Right, so first things first, let's make it look nice. So I'm going to put in some CSS files. This is going to be what we're going to use. We can change this if we don't like it. But the idea is that I have the CSS files for everything I've talked about. Now, I don't need to modify anything else here. I've put them globally so they're in index because they refer to my whole application. One of the advantages I get from using such a component framework is that everything is going to look visually cohesive, right? So everything is going to look the same, whatever that same is. Now let's go to book editor and just change this into a data table. So first, so let's just delete this stuff, import the data table component. And this is not going to work without columns. And here we're going to say data table. Well, one sec. This is not going to work without a value. I don't think it needs anything else. Right, and it has to contain, this is an empty table, so it has to contain some columns. These have a header and a field. And the same thing for content. Let's run this. And I don't think we need anything else, so we're going to repeat run it. Right, so this seems to be working. It's not stellar, but good enough. Let's continue, right? So this is working, so to speak, but it doesn't do much. So what we'd like to have is to at least have the basic operations, right? So just to have create and update and delete. So before getting back to our interface, let's just get back to our actions and our reducer. Now, the way we're going to look at this is that whenever we do such an operation, the we're subsequently going to reload the books, right, in case something happened. Which means for all these operations, for all these actions, I am probably going to update my book reducer, right? So because everything is going to end to something get bookish, right? So let's have the add book pending. Let's have the delete book pending and save book pending, update book pending. And again, the same line of reasoning is going to apply to fulfilled. Obviously, this uses so this uses case cascading, right? So I can put multiple cases and they're all going to run the same code, which is something that cases do, which is why break exists. And the same for rejected. Sorry. Obviously, nothing stops us from writing this here, although for now there are no actions that produce this. Right, so now it's time to return to book actions and add our actions. So we need a add book of book. Uh, delete book and update book. Delete book is going to be something of an ID, and this is going to be something of a book ID and book. We need types for each of them because we said we're going to be nice and organized. So we're going to say add book. Delete book and update book. And they're going to be similar, right? So like I said, for now we don't care about the errors, so we can just copy paste these and modify them accordingly, right? So in the case of add book, we're going to have a post with a header and a body, which is going to be the book stringified. This we don't even need this part, right? So we're going to just do it like this. We just care if it fails, and then we're going to reload the books, which is going to change the reduces content, and everything is going to work according to plan. This is add book, and again for update and delete. So for delete, it's going to be of book ID, so it's delete books of book ID. So delete book. Okay, one sec. So delete book. Method is going to be delete and so forth. Right, and this is going to be the same. And for this one, the difference is going to be similar to what we had for add book. It's just going to be put to something with an ID. Right. So these are my actions. Now let's get back to the only thing that is left to modify, which is the book editor. And let's see what we have to do here. So first for add. Well, the strategy we're going to employ is that I'm going to have a table footer, which is going to be a button, and when I click it, I'm going to open a dialog. Now the dialog is going to allow me to add a book, but also in the future to edit a book. So we need a couple of state things here, right? So it's of state elements. So first of all, we're going to need so we need use state. So first of all, is the dialog shown? Now it starts with the value false. It's not shown. Second of all, we're going to need to distinguish between the case wherein we're adding or editing something. And let's say by default we're adding. Third, we need something which is, if we're adding something, we need something to hold the elements of a book. So title, set title, and content, set content. And if we're going to, apart from this tank, we're going to, if we're going to edit something, we probably have to know what that something is. So selected, set selected, and by default nothing is selected. Right, so this is our state. Now, in order to have this sort of stuff, we could add delete really easily, but we're going to, since we don't have any way of adding anything for now, let's just add. Let's add the add functionality. Now, the add functionality is going to need a couple more components, so we're going to need dialog. We're going to need button, right? Because it's going to be a dialog with a save button. And we're going to need an input text because we have to edit title and content. Now, obviously, we could have used the input text from the browser, but we just want to have everything look cohesive. Now it's time for the dialog. Let's just add the dialog in such a way in which we can see that it exists and be able to close it. So the dialog is only something we care about if isAddDialog is shown. Otherwise, it's null. So here we have a dialog. Now the dialog needs a couple more things. So is it visible? Well, only if isAddDialog shown. It has a header. And it has to have something which is called an onHide. So we're going to have a footer, first of all, and we're going to call it dialog footer. Dialog footer. And an onHide, which is going to be hide dialog. Right, so a bunch of the stuff is missing. And there's something else missing, which is how we're going to open the dialog. Well, I'm going to say table footer. Sorry, footer is table footer. So let's add all the stuff we don't have. So table footer is going to be a button, and when we click the button, the dialog is going to open. And we can actually store JSX in variables. The table footer is going to be a div, which is going to contain a button. Now we could look for the documentation for button, but it has a label. It can have an icon. Now the way icons work is that it's a prime icon and it's prime icon plus. Where did I get that from? Well, if we look at this and we say icon, we can see that that's how they're used, right? They're classes which contain a name from this list. Right, additionally, this button does nothing, so on click is add new. Right, so now we need this add new function, so add new, which is going to open the dialog. So first things first, set is dialog shown true. But before we do this, maybe we want to reset the state. So set title initial state, set content initial state in case we edited something beforehand. Set selected null, and is that it? Oh yeah, set is new book true. Okay, so what else? So we need the dialog footer and the hide function. Alright, so the hide function again is not going to do something really special. It's going to say set is dialog shown false. And for the footer, well, it's going to look similar to this one, in the sense that it's going to have a save, pi save, and this is going to be some sort of function which is going to say save book, for example. We don't have it yet, nor do we need it yet, so let's just put it in so we don't get an error, and leave it at that. So we should be able to open our dialog and close it. It's labeled, not labeled. Right. So we have this and we can close it. Now we need a couple more things. So the dialog actually has to contain a form, which is going to mean I'm going to have an input text, which is going to say value is, in this case, value is title. One sec. One sec. And we're going to have a placeholder so we don't have to put labels in, so we know what's happening. And we're going to have an onChange. And this is going to be our typical onChange. OnChange is a function of event which says set title of event target value. And similarly, we're going to have an input text for content. Now let's look at our dialog now. Well, this looks fine, but nothing is going to happen on save. So let's go to save and actually add the book. So we're going to have a split logic here. So if it's a new book, then indeed it's an add. So we're going to say dispatch book actions add book, and we're going to send it the current value of title and content. And we can write it like this because it's the key title with the value whatever is in title, and the same for content. Now after we've done this, we're going to reset our state. So we're just going to say set title, set content, and everything. So this stuff. Only we're going to close the dialog. Obviously we need an else here. What happens if it's not a new book? But we haven't gotten to that yet. So that worked. Now what about deleting and editing? Well, what we need here is a sort of button column, right? Something which will allow us to select a particular row. Now, this doesn't fit with our columns until now, so we need a kind of a different kind of column, and this is going to be a template column, and this has a body, which is, let's say, ops template from operations. So ops template, now this can be one of two things. It can be JSX or it can be a function which returns JSX. And in this case, since we want to have something which is dependent on the value of the row, it's going to be a function which returns the JSX. So it's a function of row data. Return something. And this is going to return a couple of buttons. Let's just get a button from somewhere. This is a good button, and modify them. So my first button is going to be delete, and it's pi times, and we can actually use some classes, and it's going to be p. This is from prime flex p button danger. Right, so it's going to be a red button, and on click we're going to do an inline handler, and we're going to say, well, on click delete whatever this is. So delete book of this row data. Obviously we don't yet have delete book, so delete book is going to be something of row data, and it's just going to dispatch book actions delete book of row data.id. Well, how about edit? Well, it's going to say edit, and it's supposed to open the form, right? So typically it's going to be this. So pi pencil. It's going to be well, it's not as dangerous as delete, so it's going to be p button warning, and it's going to do something similar. It's going to do edit book, which doesn't yet exist, of row data. So edit book of row data is going to do something similar to what we did here. So let's just get this. Only we're now talking about something that exists. So set title is row data.title. Set content is row data.content. Set selected is row data.id. Set, it's not a new book, it's something existing. And we show the dialog. Now this sort of works in the sense that if we edit, we can see these are pre-filled in. However, we need something else, which is we need the second branch here. So what if it's not a new book? Well, if it's not a new book, we're going to dispatch not add book but update book of selected and title and content. Let's see if everything works fine. Delete works and edit works as well. So that would be a minimal application with Redux. I don't think we can do anything else, so I'm going to stop the recording and answer any questions you might have.